Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Azure Study Series. So, like yesterday, we looked through design, authentication, and authorization. So, this will be the part two of what we studied yesterday. So, Sir David, how are you doing?
Hey, doing good, man. Doing good. And you? How's it going?
Yeah, not
I'm not
bad, not
sure. I think
bad. It's
sometimes
been
I.
a wonderful day.
Okay, I thought I was hearing an echo just now.
It's okay now.
Okay. 1 minute. Let's check my system. Tell you I need to get like a new laptop. Yeah, my system is like 100% CPU.
100% CPU.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely
It's like it's like
laptop.
100% CPU. Yeah, I need to get a new laptop. But
You know, you want to splash the money on those laptops, right?
it's semiconductor shortage now that's like stopping because I could probably go for a laptop that won't be like the one that I want. I could go get maybe a laptop that I don't really want at the moment because it's the only one that's available. But then that now I have to keep it for like the next 2 3 years. Or what I
Yeah.
could do is I could try to hold on and hopefully Microsoft gets their hand on some semiconductors that will allow me to be able to order a Microsoft Surface.
It's interesting though. I
Mhm.
mean, so how long have you been looking for a laptop?
No, for like 2 months now, I've been waiting for like the
Wow.
Microsoft Surface to be available, but the spec that I want is just not available. So
Wow.
the steps that the specs that are available won't really add that much value because it's similar to the specs of my current laptop. So, and I've been using this for like a while now, so it's sort of like beginning to struggle and stuff. Yeah, but you remember that there used to be a laptop. What's it called? Is it still popular? Alien Vault. Is it
Yeah,
Vault?
yeah,
Is it
those
still popular?
massive laptop.
Yeah, the
Uh,
ones that they use for gaming, because they used to be massive
yeah,
in those days. Yeah.
I think it's still popular. If you look into the gaming world, they still use it. I think they even came out with a mobile phone that were more in line with, crazy specs. If you want to play games on it, essentially.
Wow.
Yeah, Alienware. It's called Alienware. Yeah.
That is interesting. Do you think that we're going to have um do you think that we're going to have laptops the way we're using it like in the next in the next 6 7 years, or do you think that we're going to be using our phones as a laptop? So just dock your phone in a docking station and that's your that's your computer.
I think at the moment it looks like they are trying to target the tablet market. The tablet's more like a laptop. The specs of the tablets are more like a laptop. Even mobile phones are as well anyway. But in terms of the screen real estate, obviously the tablet will take the position of a laptop, I assume.
Mhm.
Yeah. Because it's really catching up. Technology really catching up with these big chunky computer systems.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's we'll talk about that topic because it's very very interesting one. Because there was one time that was taking like the company did a fundraiser where they were trying to get people to fundraise for like a mobile phone that you can use as a computer. So it was going to be running Ubuntu. I'm not sure if you saw that. So it was meant to be running Ubuntu, and then they were like, "Oh, we want to fundraise," but I think that they fell short in the fundraising, so they just scrapped the idea altogether. But I'm sure that somebody's already working on it, where you could have your phone, dock your phone in the docking station, and it has the power of your computer, and you can do whatever you want to do with that.
It's already been done. Samsung mobile device with the
Oh
new
wow!
software they have on it, you have that option whereby once you dock it, you can use it as a computer essentially.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and
I didn't know that.
with Apple, they've taken it to the next step whereby once your mobile device, your tablet, and also your computers are connected in the same network, they can seamlessly act like they are. I mean, they can really be used as one screen essentially. So you can move a file from your mobile to your computer, and then it's seamless. You don't even have to do much in terms of setting up any sort of NAS or anything like that. It's seamless.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
interesting. So I can see that James, thanks very much for that suggestion. So James suggested that I look into Razer. So I'll have a look and look into Visa and see what they do and see if it's and see if it's something that if I can get a very good spec, then maybe I can go for that. Okay, so Kofi. So what we are discussing today. So yesterday we started looking at designing for authentication and authorization was what we started looking at yesterday. So designing for authentication and authorization. So one of the things that I found out, Sakofi, in my little IT career is that Sakofi, how are you smiling?
Well,
What?
I don't see that.
I have no idea why you're smiling. But anyways, in my little IT career, one of the things that I've learned is that what we're trying to achieve is actually very simple, right? In the IT world, as IT professionals, sometimes we make things too complicated for each other, right? And things get like overcomplicated. Of course, there are some things that are complex topics, but for the most part, what we are trying to achieve is very straightforward. What we're trying to achieve here, Sir Kofi, is we're trying to achieve comprehensive identity based access control. That's what we're trying to achieve here. Comprehensive identity based access control. And the reason why this is so important is because if you look at a typical organization, the number of applications that organizations are using today, right? So just take, for example, an organization that's just using Office 365, right? They're using um, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online. They're using Teams Online. They're using all these different services, and then had all the different applications that they're using, right? And then had all the different data stores, and then had all the different compute instances. And you can see, like, you have all these different services all spread across, and you need to be able to ensure that you have comprehensive identity-based access control implemented across your organization. And also, if you add to that that the people that need the access are not just users in your organizations, so they are users in your organizations that are working from within the corporate network, then users within your organizations that are operating outside the corporate network,
Yes.
and then there are guest users or guest partners, um, just partner organizations that your organization is partnering with, so partner users. And then you have customer users that are accessing your services and your applications from an external perspective. So you can see why this can be a bit complicated, but that's what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day: comprehensive identity-based access control. Now, one of the things that we established yesterday was that the service in Azure that helps us to achieve this or implement this, the processes that we want to implement, the service that we want to use is a service called Azure AD. Azure AD is the power behind that. And we mentioned yesterday there are two main variants of Azure AD. We have just Azure AD and we have Azure AD B2C. We mentioned that Azure AD B2C is what we use for customer facing applications, and Azure AD is what we use for typically corporate applications. So that's what we established yesterday. Then what we started doing was we started looking at some of the design principles around Azure AD. We started looking at principles like scalability. How does scalability work in Azure AD? Right. So I'm not sure if that's still if that refreshes your memory a little bit, Sakofi, in terms of what we're discussing.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. So we talked about the active and the passive and the other redundant
The secondary replicas.
replicas. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then we talked about availability as well.
Yeah. And with availability, we mentioned that a lot of that responsibility is also on the Microsoft side.
Right.
Microsoft
Yeah,
looks after that.
all
Yeah.
managed services.
Yeah. So today, and then we started looking at security also. So we started
Yeah.
looking at security and how that works. So today, what we're going to do is that we're going to carry on looking at security, and we're going to look at how some design principles around security. So let's have a look at that. So yesterday is where we stopped. Yesterday, let's go to security. So yesterday we stopped by looking at one of the first point of Azure AD security is that we want to add in Azure AD default configurations, right?
Yeah.
And we saw the example yesterday. Some of the default configurations are
Azure.
essentially, yeah, they're configured more about collaboration than versus security, right? So guest users can invite other guest users into your organization tenant. Um, Users have access to the Azure AD portal by default, and users can register applications by default. So those are default settings that we want to have a look and see if they meet our requirements. Users can connect their LinkedIn account to Azure AD. So you want to have a look and see if that meets the requirement of your organization. So that's what we established yesterday. So the second point of Azure AD security that we want to look at, Sir Kofi, is this. We want to control who has access to Azure AD using role-based access control. So Azure AD as an identity service, um, it's the identity service, is the identity provider. However, we can control who has access to Azure AD using role-based access control that we can use to define permissions of what people can do in Azure AD. So here are some of the things that we want to follow. We want to follow the principle of least privilege. In other words, we only want to give people permission that they really need in Azure AD. We don't want to give them permission that they don't need and permission that they don't use. Another thing when we start to assign permission is the highest level of permission that we can assign in Azure AD is a role called Global Administrator. Microsoft recommends that we have less than 5 global administrators in our organization, because global administrator means you can do everything. You can add users, delete users, modify anyone's password, reset anyone's password, add anything that you want to do. As a matter of fact, you can actually go delete the tenant if you wanted to do that as a global administrator, right? So Microsoft recommends that you have less than 5 users that are given the global administrator role in your organization. So let me bring up some documents to show you Microsoft recommendation on this. So depending on the documents that you're reading, it could vary. So here's a document from Microsoft that talks about this a little bit. So let's expand that a little bit for people to see. And if we go to the global administrator option, let's see what Microsoft has to say about that. So global administrator, where is that option? So they gave a warning where they said, oh, here we go. So giving too many users global access is a security risk, right? We recommend that you have between 2 and 4 global admins, right? So because global admins can reset the password of all users, they can add and manage domains if they wanted to. They can do essentially anything that they want to do. So Microsoft recommends in this document that you have between 2 and 4 global admins. If I have a look, sorry, Sakofi, carry on.
Yeah, I say that make perfect sense, because I mean, the less people you actually give them access to these services, essentially it's less people that that if anything happens, you can really reach out to them and see what's going on. We got a question also in the chat. Let me just bring it up real quick.
Yeah, sure.
So Herman say, how does Azure secure non-people identities? Example, service principal, managed identity, turn VM containers and functions into identities themselves.
So in terms of that, it's not really about like securing the identities themselves. It's about securing access at that level. So non-people identity. So we'll talk about some things like around monitoring and so today. So if you're talking about something like service principals, for example, what you want to do in that sense, is so service principals is number one, you want to control who can create them, right? We can create them. We can create service principals. You can limit who can create them. Now, we saw that yesterday that by default, every user can register service principals. So essentially, you want to have some governance around who can create them and then use them for authentication. Number two is you want to have a look at their access, right? So because that's like the important thing. You have the identity, fine, it can authenticate, but after it's authenticated, it needs access to something. That's where the damage is. The damage is not in the authentication. The damage is in the authorization, right? So it's like, what does this give you access to? Just like it's a good example of that is Sakofi. So let's say Sakofi gives me like a key to like maybe to like his garage, or where there's really where he's not putting anything, maybe into like it's guarding somewhere. I have the keys, not like the real damage, right? I can authenticate. But if that gives me access into Sarkophis gold farm, where he has like the gold stored, then that's a different situation, right? So,
Yeah.
so it's really about like the access that you want to monitor in that sense. So you want to monitor in terms of what access to the service principals have. So by default, if you're talking about access to external APIs, service principals operate using something called a consent framework, which means that you have to consent the service principal to have the access that it has. So the way that Azure handles that is that by default, certain consent are limited to an administrator has to approve those. So I don't want to get a bit off topic, but I just share some of those with you, Herman, very quickly. So if this opens up, I can quickly show some of that to you. So if I go over here to Azure AD, so service principals, for example, operate on the consent framework, and then you can sort of, so for example, if you want to gain access to Microsoft Graph for like a service principal, or even like a managed identity, for example, if you wanted to give it that certain levels of access, an administrator is required to consent. So a user may have registered an application. So for example, let's say a user registered an application called, I've got some Azure, I got a lot of Azure Stack stuff over here. Let me just use this expired one. So let's say a user registered this application. That's fine. The user can register the application. But what does this application have access to in terms of external APIs? If I go to the API permission section of the application, you see that the access depends on, so for example, this application has access to Microsoft Graph, can read its own profile, right? It cannot read other users' profile. But let's say I go to add a permission for this application to an external API, and I go to add a permission to say, so maybe a permission, for example, for Microsoft Graph. And let's say I'm using application permission, not a delegated permission. In other words, it's not taking on the permission of the user that's signing in, it's using its own permission. If I go to under application permission, you see that there are certain permissions that if I want to grant them, it's going to require an administrator to consent. So for example, if I want to do something crazy like I'm going to, let's say user registered this application and the user decides, I want this application to access every user's information in Microsoft Graph. Can the user do that? If the user does that, it's going to say, no, you need an admin to consent to that permission in order for your application to have that permission. So there are base guardrails that are put in place to ensure that an application is not over provisioned in terms of access, and admin needs to consent to that. So other things that you probably want to also put in place, you should want to put in place good monitoring. So we'll talk about monitoring today. We'll talk about monitoring best practices for Azure AD. So you want to monitor the sort of changes. If all of a sudden you notice that an application is granted this really, really privileged permission, you want to be alerted, or you want the right people to be alerted to that. There's a lot of details that we can go into, but hopefully that gives you some idea. Hey man, does that give you some idea on some of the things you can do with that? Hopefully. Hopefully that gives a man some ideas. Okay. So, Sir Coffee, let's move on to what we're talking about. So, we're talking about security. We said we want to limit the number of global administrators that we have, and we've seen Microsoft's document on that. What else do we want to do? We want to use cloud native account for Azure AD roles. What is this talking about, Sir Coffee? What is this talking about? For many organizations, they don't just have Azure AD, Sir Coffee.
So they have the on-prem as well.
Exactly.
That means you shouldn't bring your on-prem admin to the cloud.
Exactly, Sir Coffee. Exactly. See, you tell you like, so you have like your on-prem AD. So one of the things that you want to try to avoid is that if there's a compromise over here, you want to limit the blast radius. You want to really limit the ability of a compromise here leading to lateral movement over here. So to do that, what Microsoft recommends is that accounts that you're synchronizing from on-premises, that you're synchronizing to Azure AD, you do not grant those account administrative permissions to Azure AD, right? They're only user accounts here, and those accounts can have access to applications that you need them to access. However, you're not using those accounts that you're synchronizing from on-premises and then giving them admin permission to Azure AD itself. That's not recommended, because if you do that, if your on-prem network were to be compromised and somebody compromised that user account, they can essentially use that to move laterally to Azure AD and then to compromise further credentials over here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense in terms of some of the things that's talking about. So let's look at some other practices that Microsoft recommends when it comes to best practices on Azure AD security. So the other thing that we want to do is implement privileged identity management. So this requires us to have Azure AD Premium P2 to implement this capability. The question is, what is this capability about? Privileged identity management. What are we trying to achieve with this capability? What we're trying to achieve with this capability is this, Kofi. We don't want users to have perpetual access, right? We don't want users to, or administrators actually. Let me forget users. Administrators, not users. We do not want administrators to have perpetual access. What does that mean? If I grant Sarkofi the permission of global administrator to Azure AD, are you using that permission 24/7, Sarkofi? If I say you're a global admin to this Azure AD tenant, are you using that permission 24/7?
No.
So if you're not using that permission 24/7 in Azure AD, why should I grant that permission to you 24/7? Because now, if your identity ever gets compromised, then the person can use your permissions to do a lot of damage. But how about I set up a system to say, if Sarkofi needs global admin permissions to do certain tasks, you take on global admin permission for 1 hour to do what you need to do. And after you've finished using that permission, I remove that permission from your account. If you need it again, you go through an approval process to take on the permission. And after you've taken on the permission, you do what you want to do. And after that, we remove the permission from you. So that is something that is called just-in-time access. So I'm giving you the access just at the time that you need to use it and just for the time that you need to use it. And after you finish using it, I remove it from you. So that's one of the best practices in terms of controlling access to Azure AD using role-based access control. So let's have a quick look at that and how it works. So here's how privileged identity management works. So there's a definition. So we can use it to manage role assignments. It requires Premium P2, but yeah, let's look at how it works. So here's a quick one, Sarkofi. So I have two users here. I have Brenda and I have Bradley, right? I have Brenda and I have Bradley, and I have David, who is the administrator. So number one is that before a user can control PIM, the user either needs to be a global admin or the user needs to be a PIM admin before a user can control what I'm about to show you. So let me quickly go show you those roles over here. So what I'll do, Sarkofi, is if I go over here to this Azure AD tenant, and if I go to roles and administrator, the user either has to be a global admin or the user has to be a PIM admin. Come on. It's doing something. Here we go. So what I'll just do is I'll just filter for privilege. And you have privileged role administrator, and you can see that this user can manage role assignments in Azure AD and all aspects of privileged identity management, right? So the user has to be either a global admin or in that role. So once the user have, sorry, you were going to say something, Sarkofi.
No, we got a question, but I just wanted to step your train of thought. So just go ahead and I'll bring it up.
Yeah, no problems. So we have this user, this admin that has administrative privilege to privileged identity management, and we have these two users that we want to configure access for. So the first thing that the user does is the admin does is that the admin onboards the roles into Azure AD. So I go to say, Essentially, what I'm doing here, Sakof, is I'm saying to PIM, I'm putting you in charge of these roles. You control who manages these roles, right? That's your responsibility, PIM. So that's what we're doing there. Then number two, we're going to make the users eligible for the role that we want them to take on. So in other words, I want Brenda to be able to take on the role of global admin. I need to make Brenda eligible for that role. I want Bradley to be able to take on the owner role for Azure subscription. I make Bradley eligible for that role. Then number three, the users, whenever they need to use the role, what they need to do is they need to log into the Azure portal, go under PIM, and go through an approval process. So the user goes through an approval process, and when they're going through the approval process, they can select the role that they're eligible for. So Brenda will be able to select global admin, Bradley will be able to select owner. And whenever they select the role and say, this is the role that I need PIM, PIM is going to verify that they're eligible for that role. PIM is also going to go through an approval process if that is configured. So maybe I've configured and say, if somebody wants to take on global admin role, somebody else needs to approve before you can take on that role. Or maybe I have certain requirements, like you need to provide a justification for the reason why you need that role. Or maybe I have a requirement to say you need to provide an IT service desk ticket for that links to the work that you need to do. Right? So PIM is going to go through all those validation. And then once the validation is done, if that's successful, PIM is going to configure the permission for the user only for the amount of time that's defined. And the good thing about it is we don't need to monitor this manually, because once everything is all done, after everything is all done, PIM is going to remove the role assignment.
Okay, that answers the question here.
What was the question? So
will the permission be removed automatically or manually?
Automatically. So because one of the issues that we have with Azure AD Security, one of the issues that we have is people forgetting to clean up privileged permissions, right? Yeah, so that's also, so that will be documented, Okoyemi. So that will be documented. It will be clearly documented who took on the role, when they took on the role, everything that PIM does will be all logged. Yes. So let me quickly go show this to you. So let's go over to the Azure portal very quickly. And let's go to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a different portal now. And hopefully I do not mess up something. So one of the things that you want to do when you're configuring something like PIM is you want to be careful not to lock yourself out, obviously. So number one is I need to be on Azure AD Premium P2 to be able to use that. So if I go to Azure AD, let me just go quickly verify that I have Azure AD Premium P2. So if I go to under my Azure Active Directory, if I have a look at what I have, come on. My license is Premium P2, so that's good. So I can use PIM. So what I'll then do is I'll go to Privilege Identity PIM. And if I go, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details. So the Azure Security Engineer course, or the Azure Security Engineer certification, goes into a lot more details than what we're going to in the architecture course. So, in the architecture study. So with PIM, so the main thing to know with PIM is that if I want to manage PIM, I do the management under the manage section. So that's where I do the management, because sometimes you can confuse tasks with management. But if you want to manage it as a PIM admin, you do that under the manage section. So I want to manage Azure AD roles. So if I go under Azure AD roles, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to, you can see I can activate eligible admin roles that PIM can look after. Right? I can assign eligibility. So what I can do is that under here, let's go under roles over here. So let's go to configure one of the roles that we want a user to be able to use. So there is a role, a built-in role in Azure AD Security called user administrator. So user administrator can be used to manage all aspects of users and groups, including resetting users' passwords. So maybe for an IT service desk engineer, I want them to take on this role whenever they need to reset a user's password temporarily. So if I go under that role and I go under the role settings, I can go to configure my settings for that role. So let's look at some of the settings that I can configure very quickly. I'll be very quick with this in the interest of time. So come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. So while it's doing that, what I'm going to do also, Sakofi, is I'm going to bring up a different browser that I can use to test. So let's bring up a private window and I can use this to test what I'm about to do. So come on, come on. Let's go for Portal. And I'll log in with a user in a minute. So here we go, Sir Kofi. So activation. So what's the maximum duration that I want that to be activated for? I can say I only want somebody to be able to take on this role for a maximum of 3 hours. So when you're requesting for it, you can request for it for more than 3 hours. Do I want to require you to provide MFA when you're taking on this role? To keep things simple, I'll say none, but good practice is you want that for privileged roles, right? But I'll say none for now. Do I want to require justification? Do I want to require you to provide ticket information? Do I want to require somebody to approve, right? So if I go to approve, and I'm going to select myself as the approver in this case. So I'm going to select David. I have a lot of Davids here, so I have to select the right one. So select David. I said David is going to be the approver. So typically you're going to select like a group instead of a user. So I select that, then I go under assignments. So do I want people to, we're not going to go into a lot of these details because that's covered in the security engineer study that we'll do at some point. So do I want to notify anyone in case that happens? Do I want to notify an admin in case that's assigned? What notifications do I want? I can put in email information here. So I'm just going to go to update that, and that's for that user administrator role. So what I'm then going to do, Sarkofi, is I'm going to go to assign this role to a user. So I'm just going to go ahead and assignment for user administrator to a user in my organization. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to go to user administrator role. It's what I want to assign. And the member that I want to assign this to. So got to be careful here. So I believe I have a user called Emmy. So do I have Emmy? Oh, no, I do not have Emmy. Do I have John? Oh, no, John. Do I have Grace? Okay, let's go for Grace. So I'm going to assign that to Grace, and I'm going to go to next. So I'm going to make Grace eligible. So eligible means Grace can take on the role. Active means configure the role right now. So I'm just going to say Grace is eligible to take on that role, and I'm going to assign that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in as Grace in this environment over here. So Grace at carrotcloud.com. I'm going to put in Grace password. So hopefully no MFA. So I'm logging as Grace very quickly here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go under PIM, and you'll see the experience from a user perspective when they're using PIM. So from a user perspective, some Azure AD has this UI issues. You just need to reset it and it's going to work. So when you see those type of issues, those are temporary cloud issues that happen. So just always retry for the cloud. Temporary issues happen all the time. So always retry. So anyways, so maybe later, and I have this over here. So what I'm going to do, Sarkophis, I'm going to go under PIM. And when I go under PIM as Grace, you'll see that Grace will be able to request for that role and take on that role. So if I go under my roles, so that is where you use that. So this is where you do management. This is where you actually use what you can use. So eligible assignment, you can see that Grace can request for that role. So whenever Grace needs that role, Grace can go to activate it and then go through the approval process. right? Grace can say, how long do you need this for? I need this for this amount of time. So let's see. So you can see that Grace cannot go beyond 3 hours because I specified there needs to be a justification. So needs to reset some passwords, and I can go to activate. Now I didn't put MFA requirement. Oh, okay, yeah. So it failed. Yeah, I was like, you already have this role, Grace. So that's why that failed. So, but typically, what it's going to do is that it's going to raise a request, and then David is going to get an email. David is going to approve that, and then Grace will be assigned for 3 hours. After
Oh,
which, the role will be taken away, and sort of like that's how that works very very quickly. Okay, so
okay.
the
Before we
first,
move on, we got a few questions, so let me just bring it up real quick.
yeah.
Right, so we got a question here. Question: just in time access, perpetual access usage count is based on each login and logout session, and will average those session usage, or will it be just based on assigned time?
So just-in-time access, you mean perpetual access usage count is based on each login and logout session and will average. No, so that's just going to be based on assigned time for sure. So if you specify the time, so for 3 hours, so the moment the role is assigned, let's say at 3 p.m. today, 6 p.m. today, the assignment will be removed. So that's not based on whether you're using it or not. It does not matter. It's based on the time that it was assigned and then the maximum number of hours that it can be assigned.
Good one. Right, so got one from VJ. Say, can we integrate PIM with Key Vault?
Very, very good question, Vijay. So at the moment, PIM can manage the following roles. PIM can manage Azure AD roles, and PIM can manage Azure resource roles, right? So Azure resource roles. So those are the roles that PIM can manage. So in the past, Azure Key Vault, when it comes to access control for Azure Key Vault for the data plane, it only supported something called access policy in the past. However, just a few months ago, Microsoft released the capability for Azure Key Vault to use Azure role-based access control. So the answer to that, Vijay, is yes. Once you can integrate Azure role-based access control with a service in Azure, you can use PIM for that. So the way that that's going to work is you just need to ensure that your key vault resource, your data plane permission model is switched from using access policy. You have to switch it to using role-based access control. So I believe I have a key vault that I can use to show you an example of. Oh, no, I do not have a key vault. So I deleted everything to save some money because I realized I'm spending a lot of money. So I was like, okay, let's delete all this stuff that I was not using. But anyways, Vijay, let me see if I can show you that to you very quickly. So when you're creating your key vault now, just make sure that you select. So when you get to under the access policy section, so it's gonna try to use access policy, but what you can do is you can switch this. Yeah, here we go. You can switch the permission model from access policy to Azure role-based access control, and then use PIM to manage the role that's given permission to Key Vault. There you go. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, that's great. Go last one. So, are we covering the content of exams AZ303 with these live sessions? And I believe,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, Gaston. So we are covering the content in this. We're not going to be able to cover everything. So because if you look at the way that we're structured, we don't want to bore people. We're only doing 1 hour of study every Monday and Tuesday, right? Every Monday and Tuesday, 1 hour of study. However, um, the contents that we're going to cover, it's not just going to talk about like the topics about the certification that we're studying for. It's also going to cover things from a different perspective. So I've been in this for like a while. You can get a lot of content out there. What we try to bring to this whole series is bring a much more practical perspective a much more realistic perspective to things, right? So we try to explain things and clarify things rather than just going, here's the objective, here's the objective, here's the objective, and just throw a bunch of text on the screen. We actually try to help you to understand what we're talking about, and you can ask the questions that you may have. Okay.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay, so Sakofi, I think that we're almost running out of time. So hopefully that makes sense regarding PIM. So let's have a look at some other security component before we move over to monitoring. And let's see. So let's do this and discard that. So what other security considerations do we have for Azure AD? So the other one is we want to ensure that we enable MFA for everyone, right? So that's very important. So enable for MFA for everyone is very important, except for emergency accounts. What is this emergency account thing? Right? What is this used for? So what emergency accounts are used for is that you want to be careful not to lock yourself out. Imagine, Sakofi, if I configure and I say MFA is going to be required for everyone, blah, blah, blah. And then maybe I have a little bit of misconfiguration where my instance cannot really communicate with the MFA server. And essentially, you've locked everyone out.
Yeah, that's right.
Because you've enforced MFA for everyone. So Microsoft always recommends that you keep about 2 emergency accounts that you're going to exclude from MFA. You're going to probably exclude it from things like PIM. You're going to exclude it from conditional access. You're going to exclude it from some other security. However, because you're going to be excluding these emergency accounts from these security tools, you have to have strong monitoring configured for them. So enable MFA for everyone apart from emergency accounts. So before I get into the monitoring that we have to put in place for emergency accounts, let's talk about enabling MFA for everyone. What options do we have to enable MFA for everyone? We can do that, number one, on a tenant basis and enable MFA for everyone. In other words, discard this best practice and just go ahead and enable MFA on a tenant basis. We can do that on a per user basis. So I can go to enable MFA on a per user basis. I can enable MFA on a per application basis. And in that case, I'm going to be using something called, discard that. Apologies. So whenever we're talking about MFA, we're going to be, we can do that using on a per user basis, on a tenant basis, on a per user basis, on a per application basis using conditional access. So those are the different options that we have when we want to enable MFA. So the most recommended one by Microsoft is to enable MFA using conditional access on an application basis, right? Because that gives us a lot of flexibility. So I can construct my MFA scenarios to where I'll say, if a user is connecting from this location that's not trusted and they're trying to access this sensitive application, require MFA, right? However, if they are connecting from this trusted location and they're connecting using this method in a way that I think is less risky, maybe you can bypass MFA. So using conditional access gives us flexibility in how we apply MFA. It's not just enforce MFA for everyone, regardless of anything. That's a good practice from a security perspective. However, from a usability perspective, if you want flexibility, use conditional access. If you just want to enable it for users, regardless of which application, enable it on a per user basis. I won't go through all the details for that. I'll just show you where to do that. So if I want to enable MFA on a per user basis, I can go to Azure Active Directory, go under my user account, and I can go to per user MFA here, Sakofi.
Okay.
So I can go enable it. So regardless of which application that user is accessing, then they're going to use to provide MFA, and they're going to provide MFA. So, however, a more flexible way would be to go under security options over here. And under security options over here, I can go under conditional access. And then I can go create a conditional access policy where I can be very creative. I can, for example, say Azure Portal Access. So this is the policy that will apply when you're accessing Azure Portal, for example. And I can apply that to, let's say, all users. That's a bad idea. At the minimum, you want to exclude your emergency account always. So be careful about enabling things and not so. At the minimum, you want to say exclude your emergency account. and then maybe include all the other users based on that. And it's warning you is like, do not lock yourself out. Be careful. So for which applications do you want to enable that for? Do you want to implement this for? I can say it for a cloud application. And then is it for all cloud application? I can go to select the application that I want. In this case, if I want to enable MFA when you're accessing the Azure portal, there is a group called Azure Management that we can use for this. So Microsoft Azure Management Group. So this will include Azure Portal, Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI. I can select that option and I can say MFA will be required whenever you're accessing Azure Management tools. And again, it's warning you, it's like this is going to impact the Azure portal. Don't lock yourself out. So that's the warning that it's giving you all the time. So Microsoft must have received a lot of support cases.
Yeah.
So
So,
then,
so in case you lock yourself out, the only option is to contact Microsoft support, right?
yep, exactly. And depending on your support status, it could take up to 4. If you're like, Sarkofi, this world is very
Okay.
tough. This world that we live in, Sarkofi, is very tough if you don't have money.
Of course.
Because if all you're paying for when it comes to support is like just normal basic support, it could take up to 7 days before they get back to you. Myself and my wife always make a joke of this. Like whenever we go to like the airport and we're flying somewhere, and it's like this world always tries to remind you of your category. It's like know your place. It'll be like for the people that are in first class, it's your time to go in. So they'll get their bags, they'll scroll, they'll stroll in. Just few people. There's no queue. There's nothing like that. So it'll be like for the people that are in business class, it's your turn. For the rest of the people, line up in a long queue. So it's like you have to know your level. It's so sad, but that's the world that we live in. So it's the same thing with Microsoft support. There are different levels. So so it may take a while before they get back to you. So, anyways, so when you want to configure your access control, you can then go to grant access control, and then this is when you can now define and say, I want to implement grant access, but I want to require MFA if you're accessing this application, right? So that's how we can do that on a much more granular basis. So hopefully, does that make sense, Akofi? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
No problems. But let's look at this emergency account because it's very critical, right? So here's just some information for you. Let me go to clear the screen. So here's some information for you, Sir Kofi, on this. So about 99% of account compromise that Microsoft finds with access control, identity access control in Azure, can be stopped if customers use MFA. So actually, let's go ahead and bring up the document where Microsoft clarifies that. So they actually looked at their telemetry, and according to their telemetry, about 99% of identity-based attacks that they see in Azure AD can be stopped by just using MFA. So that's what this document covers. And again, they talked about what they looked at in terms of their telemetry to identify that. So let's see. So if you go here, so MFA presents greater than 99.9% of account compromise is what they find, right? So actually, if I do a Control F for 99, so you see that what they found is that the telemetry tells them that more than 99% of organization account compromise could be stopped by using MFA. So that's right. Important. Yeah. So and they go ahead and describe sort of like the information there. So we'll put this in the description so you can have a look at that later in the description. So this emergency account, let's talk about it very quickly because if you're going to be excluding it from MFA, then you have to monitor it closely. So here's what you need to do for your emergency account from a design perspective. So it's called emergency account. It's called break glass account. So here's what you want to do, Sir Kofi. Number one, you want to monitor its sign-in and you want to monitor any changes to it. So in other words, if anyone signs in with your emergency account, an alert should go off, right? Because this is an account that you only want to use when there's truly an emergency where you've locked things out on a global basis. So it should not be used otherwise. So you create this account, give it a very long password, lock it away, monitor for any usage or changes. If somebody changes it, maybe changes the role assignment, that should trigger an alert. If somebody changes the password, resets its password, or disables it, that should trigger an alert because you don't want it disabled, right? And then when you need it, to find out that it's disabled. So
Yeah.
you want to monitor everything. And we'll talk about monitoring before we go today, right? So that's very, very important. If there's any unauthorized access that you detect, so maybe somebody's trying to log in with it, reset the account password immediately, right? You want to get on top of that as soon as possible because that is a very sensitive account that bypasses some of your security controls. Therefore, you want to make sure that it's well monitored. Let's just talk about some other security best practices and then we'll talk about monitoring very quickly. So, some other security best practice, Kofi, is this one. For security, disable legacy authentication. So, disable legacy authentication is very important because there are certain legacy authentication protocols that do not understand MFA. So, Sakofi, MFA is not like a concept that's been around forever, right?
Yeah.
Certain protocols like POP, IMAP, SMTP, they don't understand the concept of MFA. They don't understand the concept of you try to authenticate and I'm going to challenge you for something. They don't understand that concept. So you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble if you allow these protocols to still be authenticated using Azure AD. Because with these protocols, people can bypass your MFA policies. So that's the
Yeah.
danger with this. And I've seen organizations mention this to me. So they're like, I have no idea. I thought we had MFA, but I'm seeing all these password spray attacks. Why am I seeing all these password spray attacks? And I look into their logs, Kofi, and what you find out is the password spray attacks are coming from IMAP protocols and POP protocols and SMTP and other legacy protocols because people use them to bypass MFA. So you want to be very careful with them. So the way to disable them is typically use conditional access to disable them. So I was showing you just conditional access some minutes ago. So what you want to do is when you're doing your conditional access, you want to check. So for example, um, you want to check the condition for conditional access, and you want to check the client application that's coming through. And you want to say if the client application is a legacy client, in terms of if it's legacy authentication client, Exchange Active Sync, or other legacy authentication client. So you're going to specify that and you're going to say you want to deny access. So that's what you do. So
Okay.
for legacy authentication client, have a policy at the top that denies blocks access to legacy clients. So that way you're going to avoid that issue. So let's round up to this. I'll cover very
Yeah,
quickly.
we've
Let's
got,
talk
we've
about.
got a question from Gaston. Let me just bring it up. Say, does I guess conditional access available for all plans of Azure AD, even if they are free?
So
AD
it's
version.
from Premium P1. So you have to
Yeah,
have a minimum of Premium P1 for conditional access. So, okay. So is that the only question?
that's the question. Yep.
Okay. So let's round it up for today. Let's talk about monitoring and then we'll see. So when it comes to monitoring of Azure AD, there are different perspectives that we want to take. First of all, you want to monitor for Azure AD Service Health, right? You want to monitor for is there any issue going on the Azure AD side of things? That's very important because the last thing that we want, Sakofi, is somebody raises a case and says nobody's able to access the Azure portal, nobody's able to access Key Vault, our applications are failing to access container registry, right? Or stuff like that. And then we begin to troubleshoot. We're making changes, we're disabling MFA, we're blocking all kinds of stuff. And then later we find out that there was something going on the Microsoft side that was causing the issue. But now we've made 15 changes, and now we have to go back to go roll back all the changes that we've made. So we don't want that. So what we want to do is that if any issue is going on the Microsoft side of things, we want to know about it. And the way to do that is to use something called Azure Service Health. So with Azure Service Health, we can monitor the state of certain services in Azure. So if I go over here and I look for Service Health over here, and so I'm not going to configure everything in full because again, we're just explaining certain issues. So if I go to under service health, what I can do is I can go configure a service health alert and I can go ahead and alert And the alert is to say, um, let's say for the service, I can filter for Azure Active Directory here. So I can do the same for Azure AD, Azure AD B2C. And I can say if anything is going on in Azure AD globally, because it's a global service, right? Anything going on in Azure AD globally, I want you to, if it's a service issue, if it's a planned maintenance, if there's a health advisory or security advisory, I want you to send a notification to this action group. So the action group could be an email notification. So there's an email notification over here. It could be if there's a ticket in an IT service management system, right? It could be send a webhook request into maybe Jira or another service somewhere. So there are different options that we have. But that's how we do that monitoring of the Azure Service Health. So and we can do that for Azure AD also. So the other thing that we want to also monitor when it comes to this is administrative event. So this one is very important, Sir Kofi, because this is how we find out, for example, certain sensitive events, right? So a good example of that would be who made this change? Who deleted that account? Who reset the password for that account? Who added that service principal? Who granted the permission to that service principal? Right? So all those types of questions we want to be able to answer. In order to be able to answer that, we use something called audit logs in Azure AD for that. So if I go to Azure AD very quickly, and if I go to my Azure AD environment on the left hand side over here, we have audit logs, and you'll be able to see all the changes that are going on. Who made the change? So, for example, I configured PIM just a minute ago. I
Yeah.
configured user administrator and I modified those settings. It's like somebody did this. So, and it's going to tell you the whole story of who did it, exactly when they did it, what configuration did they do. David did this at this time, and this is the target, and this is the detailed information on the modified property of what David did, right? So it's going to give you the full information. So this is what we want to use to monitor that, and we can filter that up until the last about 3 months that we can go. So with that, so the other thing that we can also use for this very quickly, because I'm looking at the time, is we want to look at provisioning logs. So what is this provisioning logs thing? I won't go into a lot of details on this side, Coffee, because of time. But in Azure AD, Azure AD supports a protocol called SCIM. And what SCIM allows us to do is to integrate external services into Azure AD for auto provisioning. What does that mean? That's a lot of words. Here's what that means. Apologies, I won't be able to get into details because of time. We only have 1 hour together. But here's an example of what that looks like, Sir Kofi. So let's see application provisioning. So here's an example. So whenever, for example, Sir Kofi, whenever a new user account is provisioned over here, you want to automatically provision that in your external services like Salesforce and the others. Or maybe there's another good option. So let's go to how application provisioning works. So this, yeah, so it's a good picture. So for example, maybe you have like your HR system, Sarkofi. So HR are adding new company users. You want to automatically provision the users in Azure AD once that happens, right? So you can use the Azure AD provisioning service to do that. Or maybe if there's a new user that's provisioned in Azure AD, you want to automatically integrate that with an external service like maybe Salesforce or Box or some other stuff, then you can use Azure AD provisioning service to do that. All the activities that Azure AD provisioning service is doing are logged in the provisioning logs. So that's the logs that you're going to find those information on the provisioning logs. So again, the information that you're going to get from there, it's similar to the information that we get from audit log. Who made this change? Who deleted that? Who added that? When did that happen? You'll find that under provisioning logs over there.
All right.
Then finally, let's go through some other quick ones. So, you want to audit authentication event, right? So these are sign-in information. When did the user sign in? Which client are they using the sign-in? Are they signing in without MFA? All those type of information you find in sign-in logs. So you see sign-in logs on the left-hand side here. So that how you exactly who signed in, which application did they access. And the good thing about it is this is not just for user sign-in. This is for non-interactive sign-in. So if you're using not non-interactive client to sign in, if you're using service principals to sign in or managed identity. So Eman asked the question earlier about managed identity and service principals. So let's say you have a managed identity or service principal that accessing registry, key vault. You can actually track every single sign-in that's taking place. You can track that over here, and you can configure alerts and monitoring if you detect any risky events that's happening. So this actually goes not only for users, but for service principals and for managed identities. And there's identity protection information, but we'll talk about that later. So what you want to do is that you want to centralize this Kofi. You want to um, take service health information is going to be logged in Azure Activity Logs, and audit log, provisioning log, and sign-in logs. You can export them from Azure AD. You can export them into a third-party service. So if you wanted to do that, you just go under diagnostic settings over here. And under diagnostic settings, you can go to add the diagnostic settings, and then you can collect all these logs, audit logs, sign-in logs for service principals, managed identity, provisioning logs, ADFS sign-in logs, and then you can send them to an external service where you can do further analysis if you wanted to. So that's how you collect them and send them elsewhere. In terms of the options for where you can send them to, this is where I'll end. You can send them into, you can send both service health issues and all these other issues, you can send them into Event Hub. So the main use case for this one is you're streaming it to a third-party service, maybe like a Splunk or some other service, right? So you can send it to Event Hub, collect it with a third-party service. You can stream this into storage account if you wanted to. So you can stream any one of them into storage account. And that's typically used for archiving the logs at a very low cost. Or you can send any one of them into Log Analytics Workspace. And that's typically used for event correlation and further analysis. So, Sarkofi, that's where we're going to stop today because of time.
That's really impressive. We got a question from Gaston again here. So let me just bring it up on the screen. So he said, why do we need to validate the break glass account?
What do you mean by validate, Gaston? So by validate, I guess you're talking about exclude. Is that what you mean? Because if you're talking about exclude, we need to exclude it because we do not want to lock ourselves out. So the main reason for the break glass account or the emergency account is to ensure that if you make a global mistake that locks out everyone else, you can use this account to recover. So that's the whole point of the emergency account. So you have to exclude it from things that can cause issues. So like MFA or conditional access, right? So you have to exclude it from that. But because you're excluding it from that, you have to monitor it more closely because this is excluded from your security policies. Okay.
Yep. So that's what we have. It's been a wonderful session. I've learned a lot. I mean, the way you went about, obviously, from the PowerPoint and then obviously showing the services, it's been really helpful. I hope you carry on with this. And the graphics that you were showing is amazing. I bet you spent a lot of time setting up all these, PowerPoint. So, yeah. I mean, we do appreciate that.
You promised me some Bitcoin, so
yeah.
So, yeah, it's amazing. Whenever I hear Bitcoin, I get excited. Actually, Bitcoin for coffee, that's a different level. So what are we doing next week? Let me just quickly see.
So this is the end of today, this week's session. So what do we have next week? This is what we got. So next week, Monday, yeah.
So sorry, carry on, Sarkofi.
There you go for it.
Oh no, we're going to be talking about governance, part 1 and part 2 next week. So we're going to look at designing for governance. So there's something that I wanted to share with everyone around authorization and authentication that I didn't have time to share on today. So what I'll do is at the beginning of next week, I'll share those information because I want to make this practical for you. So what I wanted to share is around how to structure that. So for example, you have to take your applications and break them down into different tiers and categories. So for example, applications that users access and that are used for administration. So applications like the Azure Portal, Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell. So those are applications that typically you have privileged users that will be accessing those applications. Then you have applications that maybe you use for your business processes. So maybe you have not only privileged users, but you have just normal users of your organizations interacting with that, and you have guest users from outside interacting with that. So initially, you set your applications up in different tiers of applications. So you have tier one, which privileged users use. You have tier two, which are probably being used by external users. Also, tier three, which are mainly applications that are consumed by other applications. Maybe you have like your DevOps pipeline consuming Key Vault or consuming other stuff. So when you break this down into different tiers and then you implement different levels of authorization across the different tiers and different levels of control. So, for example, privileged identity management may be much more required when you're talking about tier one applications. So, I wasn't able to get into that today because of time, but I'll probably start with that next week, and then we'll get into governance and the others.
Opeyemi was asking about labs. Yeah, we will definitely have labs coming up pretty soon. Yeah.
So no problem. So Sakofi is working on it. I tell you, Sakofi is cooking up something that you find very, very delicious.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And we got Gaston. He said he saw something like validate every 90 days. So this is the follow-up to the question.
Okay. Okay, I see. So validate every 90 days. Yes, of course. Validate every 90 days is important because again, the last thing that you want is like disaster recovery, Gaston. The worst thing that can happen to an organization is there's a disaster that happened and you go, let's trigger a DR plan, and you're like, we actually haven't been, our backup has not been successful for the past 6 months. And you're like, oh no, we're in trouble. We have to close down. So the last thing that you want is when you need this emergency account, it's not working. So you want to constantly validate that it's working. So that's what we're talking about.
I think you mentioned it somewhere about, let's say the account is disabled. So that's why you need to constantly monitor it just in case it happens like that.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Okay, so this is the end of this week's session. Thank you guys for joining the session, and I hope we will see you guys next week, Monday and Tuesday as well. So once again, thank you and have a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are.
Thanks. Sakofi, before we go, when are we going to Ghana? Because the lockdown is going to be lifted on July 19th.
Yeah, it will be lifted, but I guess we have to wait until next year.
Yeah. Right. Well, I was looking forward to it. I'm a bit tired. I want to go out a bit.
You want to go?
We need to go to Ghana, Sakofi. We need to.
Yeah, definitely. No worries. Yeah, it's something that we have it on in the books, so definitely we'll accomplish that.
No problems. Yeah. See you.
All right, thank you guys.
See you. Bye, everyone.